Hey there, everybody, and thanks for taking time out of your day to come along and catch up with myself and Weh Yeoh from UMBO, who I'm just about to get straight out of the guest studio. G'day, Weh.
Hi,
how
Yianni.
you doing?
Yeah, I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm fantastic, thank you. Thanks very much for taking the time today. Wanted to get you on, have a little bit of a chat about your story. You've been a real innovator in the healthcare space in getting into the telehealth service delivery model right from the get-go with UMBO. But just before we get into the UMBO story, perhaps in your own words, tell us a little bit about yourself, your journey, and what kind of led to the UMBO story.
Yeah, well, firstly, thanks so much for having me and reaching out. My background's a physiotherapist, and I studied physiotherapy at uni, worked for 2 years as a physio, and then I realized that I wasn't very good at it. I ended up taking a journey in Southeast Asia. I traveled for about 2 years. I did some volunteering in an orphanage. I studied Chinese in China, and I realized that a lot of the world doesn't live like us. And I came back to Australia to study a Masters of International Development. And after that, I ended up working in China for a while, also in Cambodia for about 5 years. And I set up an organization called OIC Cambodia, which works on developing speech therapy as a profession, because in Cambodia, there are no speech therapists. When I handed off the leadership to local Cambodian team, I then moved back to Australia. And then I discovered that there's another problem here in terms of access to healthcare, but it's mostly in rural and remote. And you mentioned me as the innovator in telehealth, and I just want to make it very clear that it's not me. There have been people that are doing it for a long time, of which one of them is Ed Johnson, one of my co-founders, who's been doing it for close to a decade. And that's kind of where the idea for UMBO was brought up around, well, maybe we can use this very well-researched, well-documented method of delivery of services to increase the reach and help people, particularly in rural communities, access speech therapy and occupational therapy.
It's it's one of those things that I've noticed with technology over the years, that there seems to be this really long lag from when the technology becomes available and when it actually starts to kind of, break through. So I think that kind of, when you talk about 10 years with your co-founder having already explored using online modes to be able to engage and deliver with healthcare is, it's really, that's really leading edge kind of stuff.
Of course. Just 1 second, I just got to get rid of this.
Okay.
Sorry.
This is the magic of live stream. So for those who are watching at the moment, we've got Weh Yeoh, who's a co-founder of UMBO, which is an online therapy provider, particularly around speech therapy and occupational therapy as well. And Weh's had to quickly duck out and address his doorbell. And we're sort of just doing a little bit of a background in terms of some of the leadership around telehealth innovation in the space. I was just going to make a comment actually around the way that technology enters the market. Weh, I'm just sort of picking up the idea and kind of just, I'm kind of improvising here just while you're answering the door there, but welcome back. So we're sort of talking about that innovation side of things, where to really get, to really make change, you've got to be, there's a subset of the community that's always sort of, going into places where the rest of the, the rest of the community isn't at this point in time. And you were talking about your co-founder, and you're talking about the inspiration that sort of led towards where you were going with it as well. I just wanted to point out, telehealth is not a radical concept. It's been around for a long time. But there has been a really small percentage. In fact, I was looking at some statistics recently, just prior to COVID-19 as an example, when you look at the Medicare claims and the item numbers that were actually being utilised prior, you're talking about, 1%, not even, of total Medicare activity that was actually being addressed through telehealth. And I think it had in part something to do with the way the incentives have been put in place around geographic restrictions and some of the other criteria. that needed to actually be met. And we could probably get into that and unpack that a little bit more when we talk about the future. But now that you're back in the seat and you're with us again, Weh,
delivered. You
got your parcels delivered, which is great. Another online benefit there of goods and services that can be provided to us today. Why don't we pick up from where you're just at in talking about the journey, the 10 years prior, supporting people in regional communities, and some of the inspiration you had around telehealth.
Yeah, well, it is incredible to think about Australia, by some measures being the second wealthiest country in the world, that for a lot of people who do live in regional Australia, they're still waiting 6, 12, sometimes 18 months to have very basic healthcare, such as speech and occupational therapy. And I think this was really something that I found really hard to grapple with. As you mentioned, Yianni, people have been doing this for so long, including one of my co-founders, Ed. And it seemed to me kind of common sense that we could use this as a way for people to access services in a much more timely manner. And one of the key things that we founded UMBO on was about approaching this situation with empathy and compassion. And I think that's really why we've been able to get quite a bit of traction with UMBO, particularly in communities that they're used to people coming in and out all the time. However, when you lead in with the message of, we are not experts in your lives, we're here to walk alongside you, and we're here to understand your situation and often just to listen, then I really think that does change the way in which people respond. I've found that in Cambodia, in places that I never thought I would ever be. And to be able to say to people, I'm not the expert, despite the fact that I've got university degrees, you are the expert, and I want you to help me to understand your life. Well, that same approach works really, really well in a healthcare context in Australia.
I recall I was watching you online with you did a TedX talk a little while back, and you were kind of talking about some of the reflections that you had around community-based services and charities and what have you. Do you want to summarize some of your thinking, or has it evolved at all since that TEDx talk, or you sort of still have a similar mindset and still that same aspiration for what you think should be done at community levels?
Sure. Yeah, so the talk is about why international charities need to make themselves redundant. And it comes from this experience that I've had working in the international aid sector, where a lot of charities are set up with very good intentions to begin with, and seemingly they don't ever leave. So a successful charity to me is not one that grows and gets bigger, despite the way that they talk about growth as a measure of success. It's actually one which is able to say, we are shrinking and we're no longer needed anymore. And when a charity wraps up, which is very rare, unless it's a extraneous situation like lack of funding, that to me is true success. But I think underpinning this whole model, and it's a model that we've used in Cambodia with OIC Cambodia, underpinning all of this is really that understanding of where we actually are as privileged people who come from Western countries, as healthcare providers, as people that are in that top 1 to 5% of wealthiest people in the world. How do we sit in all of this? And it's our self-awareness around that. And then, of course, as I mentioned, approaching people who are not used to being listened to with that feeling of empathy and compassion. That's how you result in something that really works for them and is really beautiful to see that result.
So tell us a little bit more about UMBO and what you're hoping to achieve there. It's an interesting business model. You've got two sides to it, really, haven't you? Is that a fair sort of summary? Take us through the therapy side, and then we'll sort of talk about the actual training and development side as well.
Sure. Yeah. So there's absolutely, as you mentioned, there's two sides, and both are experiencing incredible amounts of growth because of COVID-19. So the side on the therapy side is we're a clinic which is entirely online. We hire the therapist all around Australia. In theory, we can have therapists that are Australian trained and registered but are living overseas. And that would be a huge benefit to us because of time zones, being able to provide therapy after hours. And then we find clients who are usually families, but we have adults and children all around Australia that are requiring the service, but typically have to wait too long to get it. match them together. The therapy happens online. We use existing software to do so. The second side is really about building up the sector and their ability to provide therapy online, particularly rural practices. We ran a summit about 2 months ago now, where we had over 500 people attend to help them to transition from doing face-to-face therapy to online. And we got a lot of really good feedback from that, including from some people who said their businesses were close to bust until they attended that summit, and then were able to learn how to then convert to online practice. So both of these things exist because of our need really to make sure that people in rural communities don't miss out, but also to build their capacity to do it themselves. I think they both work really well together. There's a real risk of us being an online clinic like everybody else, having most of our therapists that are based in cities, having most of the clients that are based in rural communities. And that just further increases the inequality between rural and urban. And our goal is absolutely not to do that, but to make sure that these rural communities are upskilled and have the resources remain there.
So the decision was made that you would actually deliver that completely online, for all those reasons, that sort of background, the history, being able to deal with the reach as well. What's that been like to provide healthcare online? What would you say would be let's start with the differences between not doing it online versus doing it online?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, you can imagine that prior to COVID-19, there was so much resistance to moving online. And interestingly enough, a lot of the research suggests that this resistance comes from practitioners more than it comes from clients. Of course, because of COVID-19, we've had to transition online very quickly. So the differences really are, of course, that you can expand your reach so much further because your clinicians don't have to be in the same place as the clients. And when we talk about regional Australia, people sort of just say, well, we don't have enough clinicians. It's not as simple as that. There are actually clinicians around. It's just that they're not given the opportunities to work online or from their home or when and where they want. And coming back to that point around empathy and compassion, that doesn't just apply to us, to the clients, as in the families. It also applies to the clinicians. So to use a specific example, one or two of our therapists have particular conditions like medical conditions and disabilities where they're far better off working from home. Because we're able to provide these opportunities for them to work from home in places that they're comfortable, sometimes even lying down, we can unlock this market of clinicians who can work, and therefore we can increase the supply of the clinicians and connect them to our families. And to me, this is really important, that we apply this model of empathy and compassion, not just to the families, that is important, but to all the different stakeholders, particularly to the clinicians as well, by giving them the right types of opportunities.
There's so much to unpack in what you just said there. Firstly, the statistics are really quite staggering at the moment around the adoption rates for online healthcare. I'm not completely up to date with the stats, but as at 2 or 3 weeks ago, particularly in mental health care, there were 47% of all item numbers passed through Medicare that week were done using online modality. So that's an incredible adoption rate. And anecdotally, I'd tend to agree with the research that you were referencing there around the resistance around adopting telehealth as well, coming more from the practitioner side than from Australian consumers or people who are in need. And very recently, I've also heard from the Australian Institute of Health and Wellness that there's still a lot of people who need healthcare, but the conventional model of delivering healthcare is a barrier. So they're looking for alternative ways to be able to gain access to healthcare. So these are kind of stats, and there's still a little bit dated. We're talking, some of these stats, as only as recent, unfortunately, as 2016 onwards. So we're going to see, I guess, some more information coming out, more up to date in terms of the 18, 19, and now the 20 experience. But what have you found? Do you think it's a certain type of healthcare practitioner that can embrace the online healthcare model? Do you think, or do you think it can be trained? Is it a mindset? What are you sort of looking for when you're trying to guide and help people train, potentially even recruit people within UMBO?
For sure. With recruitment, there's not really a lot that we can look at in terms of experience of telehealth, because if we limit it just to that, we'd be talking about a select few. We really recruit on the basis of mindset. It's funny you mentioned that word, and also values to see whether or not the person is capable of transitioning to do their work online. We probably had some assumptions about the type of therapist that we'd have to come work with us. And interestingly enough, some of those assumptions have been blown out of the water. So one of the assumptions you might have is that the therapist is probably going to be younger because it involves a fair bit of technology, and you would assume that younger people are more comfortable with technology. Actually, quite a number of our therapists are later stage in their career. I won't dob on them by telling you their ages, but they're certainly towards the tail end of their careers. And the reason why they're coming to us, I think, is because of this notion that they still have a lot to offer, but they don't necessarily have the drive and desire to slog it out at their own practices. They want to fit in a little bit of therapy here and there. A really good example would be the kind of therapist who, let's talk about a younger one who maybe has young kids. She might drop the kids off at school, do a couple of hours of work in the morning, have an appointment in the afternoon, pick up the kids, feed them obviously, and then put them to bed and do a couple more hours afterwards. And often when therapists come to us, they ask us, how many hours do you expect me to work as a typical kind of job? And our answer usually is, well, you tell us. Because our whole theory of change is predicated on that idea that if we give people the opportunity to work when and where they want, the hours they want, being really flexible about it, we will unlock this job market that is there, but is potentially a little bit dormant. And therefore, that issue about the supply of therapists isn't an issue anymore. So yeah, in terms of the types of therapists that would be ideal, it is mostly about mindset, I think. There's a wonderful book called The Entrepreneurial Clinician, which is written by Jo Muirhead, who actually is my coach. And she talks about, as clinicians, how we are taught a certain set of skills and values that are really at odds with what it takes to be an entrepreneur. We're not taught to take risks. We're not taught to do things unless it's perfect. We're not taught to do things unless there's evidence. But to be entrepreneurial, to have that spirit of entrepreneurism, is to actually do all these things, which are very much at loggerheads with what we're taught at uni. Those clinicians do definitely exist, though, and we're gradually bringing them on board.
I've read that book, and haven't had the pleasure of meeting Jo personally at this point. We're a bit ships in the night in the industry, but
you should get her on the podcast. She's amazing.
I would love to have her on. We're just going to have to get our schedules aligned at some point in time. But I think that is a really important transformation opportunity, I think, for the industry, where, look, entrepreneurialism, it's kind of an interesting term because in some ways it's heavily associated with disruption. But it doesn't necessarily need to be that, does it? It needs to be, I kind of relate to entrepreneurialism really as about bringing together collaborations and communities. It doesn't necessarily mean to disrupt, although that could be one aim. But another aim for it could be to actually be able to sort of, pool resources, be able to share and collaborate in terms of everybody's joint experience with a particular subset of the community, or what we're all sort of experiencing. And I think a part of that is also that, whilst the healthcare industry has a lot of rules and regulations around it that are, put a burden on the healthcare practitioner, we also need to find ways to actually care for the practitioners as well, and provide much more support systems for, for being a healthcare practitioner, and then also being in the business of providing healthcare services as well.
Just two things to pick up on there. Yeah, I mean, you're spot on. I 100% agree. The first thing, I remember doing a presentation on UMBO maybe last year to a council, and afterwards, this gentleman came up to me afterwards and he said, what you're doing at UMBO is just so innovative. And I never thought of it like that, And I said to him, I didn't really see it like that. What we're doing is we're matching supply and demand. They do exist out there, but we're just using existing technology and methods to try and get the supply where the demand is, which is online. The second thing in terms of caring for clinicians, so particularly now in COVID-19, I believe people are feeling more insecure, more stressed, more anxious than they would ordinarily. So again, if you're coming from that point of view of let's lead with empathy and compassion, you have to apply that to your team too. We've done a number of things at UMBO, but one of the simple things we've done is at the beginning of every meeting, we have given everybody a space to just download a little bit. How are you feeling? What's going on? What's the things that's really bugging you at the moment? What things are you grateful for? What are you proud of in terms of your work? It's not, and meetings should never be the leader talking. Those are the worst types of meetings. But when everybody is speaking about their own experiences and having a space to share that, it's kind of incredible, because at the beginning of COVID-19, everyone was very anxious. And once we gave them that space, they then transitioned from, sure, I've still got anxiety, but I've also got a job to do. And they put their heads down and they worked extremely hard. And that's why in the last 2 months, we've seen this enormous growth within UMBO.
And where's the growth coming from?
It's coming from the situation in some senses. I think that people are starting to see the value of online therapy. As I mentioned, of course, it's not something that we haven't been doing before. UMBO's been around for over 2 years. Some people have been doing it for a decade-ish. But I think this sense that, you can actually achieve really good results online. And without a lot of alternatives at the moment, with lockdowns and restrictions on movement, this seems to be a good option. The question then really is about, is this adoption going to continue after COVID-19 settles down? And what will things look like when we get back to, in inverted commas, normal? I don't know, and I'm not even going to try and speculate.
It's an interesting one. Yeah, it's an interesting one. What is normal? Is this the new normal? Does it persist? Do we just come out of lockdown and everything snaps back into where it was in 2019, for example? What do you think is probably the most likely scenario?
Well, in terms of our very narrow area around online delivery of health, I don't think we're going to see perhaps as exponential a growth maintained for that long. It's simply not possible. But I do think we're going to have a significant number of people using online delivery and then wondering, when things go back to normal, we're allowed to move around again, why was I traveling hours to get this service, which is equally good online? Why was I spending money for my staff to drive all around cities or in rural communities? How come I've been able to do therapy in the house where the child is, in their natural environment, and see really important things, and I can't do that when I get them to come to my clinic? So I think there'll be enough people to see the benefits of it that'll be maintained afterwards. And the new normal will see a lot more of this. In general, I think we're just going to see a lot more of working from home, a lot more of online interactions. A lot of people have talked about during COVID-19 how they've connected with friends and family overseas and haven't spent so much time doing it. I've personally had the same experience, having lived in a few countries and reconnecting with people that I met over there, and it's been really great. So I think COVID-19 in general is an opportunity for us to question, well, what kind of normal do we want to have? And is it sustainable? What kind of society do we want to build afterwards? Do we want to continue along 2019? I don't personally think we should.
Yeah, I think the original part of the original vision of tele anything, back in the day, was that we were going to make all these big gains as a community, as a society, and the big issues such as pollution, environment, logistics, the urban sprawl, all of these things that I can remember from high school through college into the university system. These were kind of emerging issues, big issues that were being spoken about. Now they've sort of really dominated the mainstream political agenda. But yeah, you're right. So many people are seeing benefits now that when they do need to go somewhere in the car, everything's quick and easy, because there's hardly any traffic. There's a novelty and a kind of an excitement that I'm hearing through my family and friends around doing telehealth, and it's a kind of a topic of discussion that comes up, when we're in our online catch-ups with each other. It's like, oh, what have you been doing today? And oh, I had a telehealth appointment, with my doctor or with my my psychologist or whatever it was, and these are kind of this is kind of I think the new pattern or habitualization, if you will, where any resistance that we had perhaps when there was no pressing need to make the change, the pressing need has now forced us to engage, and through that engagement we say, oh, that was okay actually, and it was pretty convenient. And it worked pretty well, and and I've talked before about how much time it takes to actually do any kind of appointment, let alone a healthcare appointment, because of the whole logistical exercise that you have to go through, as an example.
Yeah.
So I think there definitely will be some persistent use of telehealth going forward beyond COVID-19, and now that everyone's infrastructure is in place, I think that might be the next area where evolution will come about.
Sure.
The tools that have been chosen, people will start to be able to actually really live them and see whether they're actually productive and really helping them, deliver the healthcare service or not, and sort of work through those kinds of refinements.
When I mentioned before, we had this summit that we organised, 500 plus attendees, right around the first or second week of things getting a little bit crazy.
Yeah.
One of the key things I remember is someone saying, I've been wanting to do telehealth since about 2003. And it's always been on the back burner for me. But, and I'm paraphrasing here, nothing quite like a pandemic to get, your house in order. And I think about this a little bit because it's unfortunate in some sense that we need this very strong external stimuli to do things that potentially we should be doing anyway. And coming back to that topic of leadership as well, is that leadership and innovation shouldn't necessarily require the world shutting down for you to do something that has a lot of benefits, particularly for people that you're trying to serve. And it's very difficult to predict what that next trend will be, but obviously the earlier you can get ahead of the curve, the more time you'll have preparation to ride that wave when it comes.
So let's take COVID-19 out of the equation. So let's imagine what that version of life looks like. We've still got some big issues in healthcare that existed before COVID-19, and you were touching on it a little bit earlier. But there is seems to be a lot of challenges in actually recruiting into various aspects of healthcare. And I think you were making a really great point around the UMBO story around sort of helping provide pathways for people who do want to work, but the traditional model is a barrier, because they want to balance family, children, lifestyle, some other aspects of it as well, or perhaps the concept of a business day just doesn't fit natively within their day. So those issues don't go away just because COVID-19 lockdowns have been lifted. There's still a lot of demand out there, particularly with the NDIS as a massive influence over funding and driving demand for therapy and healthcare services. So perhaps recruiting alone, there's got to be a really solid argument now that as a healthcare provider, you're limiting your options for the pool of people that you could otherwise employ by not having more flexible workplace arrangements. Would that be a sort of a fair kind of theory that we'll have to pivot?
Absolutely great theory, and it's a great summary of the situation as a whole, I think. And we have this concept of person-centered practice whereby we say everything is guided by the person that we're providing therapy to, etc. But person-centered practice is one thing, but it doesn't really seem to make sense that we then also say, come into my clinic between the hours of 9 to 4, which is on the other side of the city, by the way, or 200 kilometers away if you happen to live in a rural community. So for us, it's really about reshaping what that means. I mentioned before also this idea about people working in time zones. Prior to COVID-19, we were going to have some clinicians based in Asia and in Europe. And what a wonderful thing to be able to provide, let's say, therapy on the east coast of Australia during office hours for a clinician. But we're only able to really do that if we provide that flexibility to the clinicians themselves. And again, it is really about empathizing with their condition and the situation. And some of those clinicians that I mentioned before who have now been able to work with UMBO because of this flexibility and compassion have some really quite hard to hear stories, I think, about employers that aren't open to them working from home or working in the ways that they want to work. And for me, that is, a big part of our story, that I'm just so proud that we're able to give these people opportunities to contribute and to work, because of course they just have so much to offer.
I think that's the key. That's part of leadership, isn't it? It's kind of look, if we either personally we don't like the way the system works at this point in time. I know that was a big part of my motivation when I was looking at the way that my so-called career was playing itself out, and there was no soul food in it. I didn't really feel that connection with meaning and purpose and some kind of higher motivation. So I got the hell out of the career and just completely reconfigured my life around something that could work for me and align my energy. And in those days there was nothing. There was really early days. The tech, again, going back to my earlier point, the tech was there. It wasn't as good as it is today. I mean, we had to do kind of teleworking type of arrangements using really heavy IT systems and VPN type setups to make it work. We're sort of talking early 2000s as an example, late 90s. But I do remember my first encounter with healthcare. It was before Core Plus, actually. It was in teleradiology. And there was an incredible amount of resistance from the prevailing culture around the idea that you could actually do a read an X-ray from a web browser at that particular point in time. And what was interesting is that there were a couple of early adopters within the space who saw the opportunity, and they completely transformed their lives. They were, for example, prior to the teleradiology capability that we were putting into the market at the time, they were contracted to one hospital, and they would effectively the work model was, if there was an emergency room requirement for a radiologist to read an X-ray, they had to come in, and so at 3 o'clock in the morning they'd have to get up, get dressed, drive to the hospital, and so much so that the actual industrial ward at the time was allocating 4 hours of a person's time. So the resistance was actually the fear of losing the 4 hours in the industrial ward. And what these early adopters discovered is that trading off the 4 hours of a minimum payment by going in under the industrial ward, they gained multiple contracts with multiple hospitals in multiple locations around the world. And that their earnings potential actually went through the roof. It scaled them, and which was a byproduct. They didn't really have that in their intention when they were doing it. They wanted flexibility. They wanted more integration with their home lives and their work experience. But then they actually started leveraging and getting 2 contracts, 3 contracts, 4 contracts, 5 contracts, not constrained by start time, stop time, but just based on activity. And so they would do reads, for example, with the studies that they were doing, and they were actually financially better off than they were before, working less time. It was an incredible transformation.
It's an interesting example, because it's also the difference between being motivated by fear of losing that 4 hours, and what happens when you give up that feeling of fear and not let it motivate you. And when you're motivated by growth is not the right word, because you can have growth for growth's sake perhaps, but opportunities, or even a sense of duty or love or care to be able to see more people, how much that actually helps benefit you in the long run. So fear is not a good motivator. I think it was Angela Merkel actually said that. And in times like this, in COVID-19, that is an extra important thing, I think, for leaders to recognize, is that you cannot motivate people by fear, or at least you can in the short term, but it's not sustainable.
Yeah, so let's talk about some of that leadership then going forward, because I think it's important that the more people talk about and sort of overcome, or perhaps reveal those inner fears and that kind of, the reasons or perhaps the justifications for, not changing or perhaps not exploring new frontiers, new ways of doing things. Now you're leading you've got a summit coming up, haven't you?
Yeah.
Before too long. tell us a little bit more about that and what your inspiration is for it.
So 26th and the 28th of May, still working on getting those details out to you all. But the summit is there to actually showcase that online therapy and telehealth has been happening for quite a long time. And this is something that has obviously escalated because of COVID-19, but should continue to be something that is the mainstay for a lot of people after things subside. This is not like an ad for UMBO. This is really just showcasing some of the best people in the industry, as far as we can see, that are doing really interesting things and have done so. And also to help people, including families, support coordinators, teachers, GPs, parents, who want to look for other options, that there are very viable ways of doing all of this stuff online. We're going to be inviting technology providers such as Core Plus, of course. We're going to be having people from the industry to talk about infrastructure like NDIS. We're going to be talking with parents as well and recipients of the therapy. And of course, we'll be talking to practitioners who have been doing this for a while. So I'm really excited about this summit. And it really is a good time to be doing it now, as I think a lot of that initial anxiety around COVID-19 is starting to subside a little bit. And people are now wondering, okay, what are my options in terms of delivery or therapy?
I think it's fantastic. The more we actually talk about it from different perspectives, it really resonates with me philosophically, because I think that's an important part of all our lives, is to break down those barriers of feeling like, little me, isolated, I'm the only one that thinks this way, to actually then realizing, and I guess to coin one of your terms, empathizing with each other around that kind of, common ground, the shared experience that we're all kind of going through. And I love the fact that you're bringing, clients and parents into the mix as well. So it's not just kind of, an industry perspective. It's actually a holistic kind of perspective as well. So I'm looking forward to that one. And perhaps what we should do is get that link off you when you've updated the landing page for it, so we can actually share that through our social networks as well. And is that something you're likely to be doing on a consistent basis, or is this something to sort of, transition past COVID-19 and, some of the anxiety and emotion that kind of infected us as well over recent weeks?
No, I think we'll keep going with the summits. We're doing this one here, which is more about, options for people to receive therapy online. The first one was more about training or having your practice move from face-to-face to digital. And that one we had a great, reception to. We had over 500 people. I think we put it up in about 5 days. Don't recommend it. Probably better to give yourself a longer time period next time. But that's something where we know there will be changes to how people are approaching this, and it'd be great to get updates as to how that happens. And as you mentioned, bringing people together and really empathizing for their lives that they're living, that's just so key to what we do. It's so easy, I think, to get caught up in industry type conferences and meetings and forget that actually the center of this is the client. Right? So we need to spend time with them. We need to talk to them about what it is that they actually value and what their pain points are. And it's only then that we're really able to grow.
Look, I love it. I think that I'm a big fan of the intention of the NDIS, because it is one of those massive type of transformation type of initiatives that really has baked into it that client-centered care type model. And with it comes a great opportunity for us all to actually, reimagine the way we do things, so that we can actually, I've got this visualization in my head that from a client standpoint, a participant, a consumer, whatever the language is, that and there's so much language in healthcare as a starting point, but the person who is in need of healthcare, if you actually think of a healthcare system as not being a physical location, to me, that's kind of the vision I have in my mind. It's basically wherever the person is, that's where healthcare should be. And it should be anywhere, anytime. It should be in a way that really fits into their lives very nicely. And by the way, that doesn't mean that, I'm kind of suggesting that people need to get up at 3 o'clock in the morning because that's convenient for their client or their patient. But it's more about using the tech then to actually be able to bridge those gaps and divides where, it's very hard to have a physical person in anywhere, anytime. because we need to sleep, we need to eat, we've got, families and social life. So that's not pragmatic, but through digital health and using different types of tools and methodologies and sort of figuring out how to actually build out the service, for lack of a better term, so that it does wrap around the individual wherever they so choose to be, and be able to gain access to content, gain access to support, gain access to the healthcare practitioners in a way that actually really works for their existence and their life and their set of goals that they've actually set for themselves. That to me is something we could all learn from, not just be inspired by disability, but actually be able to do it right across the healthcare spectrum. What are your thoughts?
That's right. And another point that you raise is really good about the technology, and I'm sure this is something that in your experience, being on the frontier of health tech, is that the technology is something that puts a lot of people off because there's a fear around getting the technology wrong, not being able to use it, not being able to troubleshoot. And we get that a little bit in the recruitment phase when we talk to clinicians, that often is a place of anxiety. What we reinforce with them is that technology is the avenue. It's not the be-all and end-all. It's certainly not the centerpiece. It's how you approach the client as a clinician, what your values are, what your mindset's like. Are you showing that empathy and compassion that I've mentioned a few times? And that sometimes technology will fail. And for us, what we do, and particularly in rural communities, of course, is we pick up the phone and we talk to them on the phone, because to some people's surprise, phones can still make phone calls. And this, having this backup doesn't require that pressure to be on the technology to work all the time.
Yep. Well, that's great. So a backup, really important in the telehealth kind of model. I think that's a very wise point. Tech will fail. It's man-made, so it will also never be perfect. Something will always go wrong with it. And that's not a great experience for somebody who's thinking, where's my healthcare practitioner? Right. They're supposed to be here. It's almost akin to somebody walking into your clinic and there's no one there. It's not a great experience. So that's a good tip. Any other tips that have kind of come through in the UMBO experience that you think, what are your top three perhaps? So we're talking backup on video.
So this is in terms of for healthcare providers?
Yeah.
So I think having a backup is really important. I think another thing is really about trying to sit with the client and really understand from their point of view why they think this is the right way to go, because you can have a whole set of assumptions about what you think it might be, but not really be clear as to what it is for each individual person. And probably the third tip is to think big. We have a lot of conversations with people where they say something along the lines of, X percentage of our clients are quite happy with face-to-face, so why would we need to do anything online? And our point is, well, that's X percentage of your current existing client load. What about that Y number of clients that are sitting outside that client load? And what about your duty of care towards perhaps people that are not in your geographical area, regional, rural Australia? So to me, being able to do telehealth and being able to do it online is really about expanding your horizons, and there's no better time to start than the present.
Totally agree. Although I'm a bit of a groupie of the teleworking type model from, probably the last 25 years of, my working life. And it's so much better today in the tech, but I agree with you. Tech is not in of itself the answer. In digital health terms, and particularly around innovation in digital health terms, there are three key things that I think need to come together. You've used one of the terms, mindset. If you think you can, you can. If you think you can't, you can't. Either way, you're right. So you've got to have the mindset built around iterating and being able to take, perhaps I call it R&D, research and development. It's kind of, okay, so let's say our business of healthcare is, everything's fine, it's all good, it's under control. So if it's not broken, it doesn't need fixing. That could be a very normal mindset for a lot of people. But inevitably what will happen is somebody in the industry is going to push a frontier. They're going to find some new way of doing things. And slowly but surely that will start to become the prevailing, way of doing things. So I think everybody should have a little bit of R&D in them, where they're sort of, testing the waters with some clients around ways that might sound like a good idea, and make sure that the client is actually feeding back and agreeing that it is a good idea. So the mindset's really key. The other side, I do think tech is useful to combine with the mindset, but in of itself, it needs the third part, and the third part is culture, and that's basically making sure that the whole team and the leadership and everybody is coming along for the ride. Otherwise, we're just subscribing to tools, but we're not getting productivity gains out of them because we haven't actually fully embraced them. We haven't implemented them at a cultural level within our organisation. Or conversely, our culture hasn't changed, and so the actual tools just reflect the way things are, not the way that where they should be. Have you? Does that resonate with you? As a business owner in healthcare? Yeah.
I mean, we've had conversations with investors and foundations, and that question about defensibility. So the question's usually something along the lines of, what is it about your model or your business or your organisation that is better than the others, really? And my answer always comes back to culture. We have this really incredible culture at UMBO where we do use that mindset of empathy and compassion internally, externally, in everything that we do. And it's borne out in every interaction. And that's one of the key reasons why I think it's working for us. I also remember this study that I looked at. It was on Harvard Business Review, and they surveyed the top 500 CEOs, I think Fortune 500 in the States. And they asked them, what is your job as a CEO? And there's a lot of variation, of course, but the number one answer, 92% of CEOs said, my job is to set and maintain culture. And I thought that was really interesting. Like, out of all the things that a CEO could do, that is the number one thing that they thought they should do. Without that culture, you can't really do anything. If the culture is broken, it doesn't matter how great your product is, how great your technology is, how great your marketing, your social media is. It just doesn't work.
Totally agree. Wei, thanks very much for taking the time to come in and have a chat with me today, and talk through telehealth and getting beyond COVID-19, and actually kind of working towards taking advantage of some of the benefits that having most health practitioners now having a crash course in concepts like telehealth because of COVID-19 don't necessarily need to feel that it's a short-term response. It's actually something that can really make a difference going forward to them as individuals in terms of their work-life balance, in terms of their own goals for their career paths, as well as for their clients at the end of the day, and sort of, getting rid of those barriers to gaining access to quality healthcare, and doing that, with empathy and compassion. I think it's a very relevant way to be approaching, I guess, any type of business in this day and age. Any final words just before we wrap up today?
Yeah, I mean, thanks again for having me on the show, Yianni. It's been a really interesting conversation. I think just to wrap up and just underline sort of what you said is that, these words, empathy and compassion, are certainly not used very commonly in the startup world. What we are seeing now in COVID-19 in terms of leadership, let's talk about global leadership, is some leaders really showing that. And the difference that it's making is quite obvious, whereas other leaders perhaps don't have those as strengths. And the results of that is also quite obvious too. So I think approaching any situation, but particularly in insecure times where people are feeling more anxious, if you lead in with this feeling of empathy and compassion, you're going to get the culture right. And then I think good things are going to happen as a result.
Terrific stuff. Thanks, Wei, and have a great day. We'll make sure we get those links updated that you were referring to a little bit earlier as well.
Thanks, Yianni. Take care.
Thank you.